First up, we have James Bond 007, released July of 1983 on the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, and the Commodore 64. This was released in 1983 for the Atari 2600. James Bond 007 was the first ever licensed James Bond game. So you must avoid the enemies, fire from satellites and helicopters while making your way to Springs oil rig. The game is a side-scroller where you control a car that can jump and shoot items for points. Though shooting the enemies has no effect, other missions introduce new course hazards, but the gameplay remains the same throughout. Graphics are fairly good for the Atari 2600 game, though gameplay is quite repetitive and not overly enjoyable. Next up, A View to a Kill, released in 1985. It's an action game release for the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, and MSX computer system, and one of the two identical games released in 1985. Split into 3 missions, you begin by racing around Paris in a taxi and try to catch a parachuting mayday. The second mission revolves around rescuing Stacy Sutton from a burning city hall and plays like a point-and-click adventure. The final mission is a platforming level where you must jump around dangerous mine to defuse a bomb. James Bond 007, A View to a Kill was released in 1985 for the Apple II, Macintosh, and DOS computer systems. It's a text-based adventure game written and designed by future Bond continuation author Raymond Benson. It features a second-person interactive story in which you enter commands to control Bond's action and progress the story. Like most games of his genre, death is a frequent occurrence that requires you to start over from the beginning. The game opens on a Siberian mountainside where Bond must find 003 and escape. The rich text is descriptive and well-written, and environments spark the imagination. However, it doesn't adequately describe objectives, making it difficult to progress. In the first level, you have a gun but no bullets. You have a harpoon shooting ski pole, but it misses the enemy if you are in another area, and you die if they reach your area. Add in primitive command parser and lack of in-game help, you have a game with good writing, but gameplay is more frustrating than fun. James Bond 007 Goldfinger, released in 1986 for Apple II, Macintosh, and DOS computer systems, and the second and final of Microescape's James Bond games. It's a direct follow-up to A View to a Kill, released a year earlier. Although both games were written by Bond continuation author Raymond Benson, and text and descriptions in Goldfinger aren't quite as interesting, one improvement of note is the objectives are clearer, especially at the beginning of the game. However, the contents that still make for a more frustrating experience. Number 5, James Bond: The Living Daylights, released in 1987 for ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amiga, and MSX. Instead of copying the gameplay style of their first Bond game, Domark started from scratch and produced a side-scrolling shooter. You control Bond and can move right, roll, and jump. When you press left, a crosshair moves in from the right engine. You can aim and shoot anywhere on the screen. Moving the crosshair all the way to the right exit shooting mode and moves Bond forward. The controls are a vast improvement over the prior efforts in The View to a Kill, but the gameplay ends up being too repetitive. James Bond: Live and Let Die was a 1988 speedboat racing game from Domark, released on Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amiga, and DOS systems. Although it was the third James Bond title, it started out as an unrelated game called Aquablast. Domark noticed that the missions were similar to the boat chase in Live and Let Die, and decided to rebrand it as a 007 game to increase sales. The gameplay revolves around shooting and dodging obstacles while speedboating along a river. The player can jump over floating logs and slide up to hillsides to avoid getting hit. Fuel barrels must be collected along the way to avoid running out of fuel. It's a fun little game and worth playing on the 16-bit Atari ST for much improved graphics. .007 License to Kill, first released for DOS in 1989, and later released for Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, and Amiga. It's the fourth Bond game from Domark. It represented a remarkable leap in terms of graphics and had a freer sense of movement than prior Domark games. The game has 4 main levels, each with a different gameplay style. The first is a vertical scrolling shooter with Bond in a helicopter. The second level, Bond goes on foot and must kill enemies with the 8-directional shooting and limited ammo. Third level is Bond scuba diving, shooting enemies, and going underwater to dodge enemy fire. The final level is a driving level where Bond must smash his truck into other vehicles. While it does have great graphics, it lacks in-game music and the levels are far too short. James Bond, The Spy Who Loved Me, was Domark's Bond game and is widely considered to be a rip-off of the arcade classic Spy Hunter. It was released for Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amiga. Both titles are identical, feature gadget laser cars, and a vertical side-scrolling and racing game. The problem with The Spy Who Loved Me is bad controls and low production value. The boat sections have little maps to indicate where ramps are and dead ends are, but they are sometimes incorrect, causing frustrating deaths. On the plus side, the graphics and music are good on the Amiga and Commodore 64 versions. James Bond 007 The Stealth Affair was a point-and-click adventure game released by Interplay in 1990 for DOS, Atari ST, and Amiga. It features a CIA agent who has to locate a stolen stealth plane and was developed as an original title. It was released as Operation Stealth in most of the world, but Interplay licensed the James Bond name for the US market in an attempt to increase sales. Despite this, barely any changes were made from the licensed version, with Bond still working for the CIA, for instance. Overall, gameplay has mixed reviews, though it does have its fair share of fans. Perhaps one to check out if you enjoy point-and-click adventures. And James Bond Jr. was based on the animated series of the same name, which followed the adventures of James Bond's nephew, James Bond Jr. It was the first and only James Bond game from THQ. It was released in 1992 for the NES and Super Nintendo. But both game versions say the same story. The gameplay and missions were different. The NES version was a platform puzzle game, while the Super Nintendo version was more of a shoot-'em-up. For the later, the levels were either standard platforming with punching and shooting or helicopter and boat levels with one-hit deaths. Both games were generally considered to be fairly mediocre for 1992, so they hold up better than most of Domark's Bond games. James Bond 007 The Duel was released in 1993 for the Sega Master System, Sega Game Gear, and Sega Mega Drive Genesis. It's a standard platformer where you jump and shoot enemies in environments that aren't fitting of James Bond, such as a forest. The main problem is repetitive and dull level design. The Duel doesn't stand out much at all. It's just another mediocre game trying to cash in on a franchise tie-in. Goldeneye 007, released in August 1997 for the Nintendo 64 from Rare. It's considered constantly rated one of the best adaptation of a film. Goldeneye 007 for Nintendo 64 was a revolutionary first-person shooter. The game introduced a split-screen multiplayer deathmatch mode that became standard for first-person shooters. Goldeneye 007 was the first game to demonstrate that first-person shooters were viable on home consoles, selling over 8 million copies. It became the third best-selling game for the Nintendo 64 and remains the second bestseller for developer Rare, just behind the 9 million selling Donkey Kong Country, and one of the games I probably played the most on Nintendo 64. James Bond 007, released in 1998 for the Nintendo Game Boy. It was the first handheld James Bond game appearing on the original Game Boy very late in the console's lifetime. With black and white graphics and dated hardware, the Game Boy offered a first-person shooter was out of the question. Instead, the developer made a top-down perspective action-adventure game. The gameplay revolves around solving puzzles, finding hidden items, and engaging in simple close-range combat. Though not one of the most critically acclaimed Bond games, it certainly offers very unique gameplay and an interesting storyline. Tomorrow Never Dies, released November 16, 1999 for the Sony PlayStation. It's one of the first 8 Bond games developed by Electronic Arts, and certainly one of the worst games possibly. Throwing out everything that had made Goldeneye 007 such a classic, Tomorrow Never Dies features a third-person perspective, no multiplayer, outdated tank controls, and lackluster graphics. When walking anywhere near enemies, the targeting system would automatically lock on without even pressing a button, resulting in overly simplistic one-button shooting. But to his credit, it's a very good skiing game. The World Is Not Enough. Following the success of Goldeneye 007, developer Rare declined the opportunity to make another Bond game, instead choosing to go with their own intellectual property and develop the successor Perfect Dark. Electronic Arts took over and released their own sequel for Nintendo 64, The World Is Not Enough, in 2000. Ignoring their dismal first attempt with Tomorrow Never Dies, EA instead cloned the gameplay style of Goldeneye and produced a decent, if not innovative, game that met with good reviews. ESO also released the game on the PlayStation, but it was made by another developer and poorly received for its bad gameplay and lack of multiplayer.
Looking for something, James? Or just looking? Either way, I hope this will whet your appetite for adventure.
I know you like to keep abreast of things, James, so here's a little hint that might assist you.
I'm afraid I have nothing to show you yet, Mr. Bond. You're going to have to work for it.
You can turn off the charm, Mr. Bond. I'm immune. What does intrigue me, though, is a challenge. Are you up for it?
Number 16, 007 Racing, released in November of 2000 for the Sony PlayStation.
You'll note, 007, that the Stinger missile is the only way to neutralize airborne attacks.
Watch out!
Lock on your target with the Stinger missile.
Number 17, Agent Under Fire, released in November 2001 for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance. Agent Under Fire was the first James Bond game on the 6th generation consoles and was released first on the PlayStation 2, with the GameCube and Xbox ports released the following March. Since Bond games were coming out faster paced than the films, Agent Under Fire necessitated an original story and managed to pull it off fairly well. The gameplay returned to the first-person perspective and combined fun shooting and new gadgets including grappling hook and a hacking device. Driving missions added some variety and were a huge leap up from the terrible mechanics of 007 racing. Overall, Agent Under Fire marked the beginning of a stream of good Bond games from EA.
Bond, M here. I'll try to keep in contact with you.
18, Nightfire, released in 2002 for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance. This was a sequel to Agent Under Fire that improved upon its predecessor in almost every way. To begin with, it managed to capture the authentic feeling of a Bond film, opening with a gun barrel sequence, playable action-packed pre-title sequence, and a girl-filled title sequence complete with an original song. The level design was excellent, with many missions following for several unique approaches, giving the game a more open world feeling. Top that with stellar driving missions and you're left with a classic Bond.
Get me closer to the road.
Everything or Nothing, released in 2004 for PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox. Everything or Nothing is the highest rated of all EA James Bond games and arguably one of the most enjoyable. It reverted to a third-person perspective and introduced tight cover and shoot mechanics, wall-repelling action, and some extremely fun gadget-filled driving missions with cars, motorbikes, and helicopters. In fact, the game placed a greater emphasis on driving missions than any Bond game before it, and the use of the Need for Speed engine ensured tight controls and mechanism. Everything or Nothing is also the first game to include non-archived voice acting from the cast of the Bond films, including Richard King of Jaws.
Unfortunately, it's about to change hands. The wrong hands. We cannot allow this to occur. Recover the bomb and bring it back.
$100 million as we agreed.
Number 20, Goldeneye Rogue Agent, released in 2004 for PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Nintendo DS from Electronic Arts. And Goldeneye Rogue Agent starts out with not featuring James Bond and having no relation to the Goldeneye film or game. And it revolves around an ex-MI6 agent who defects to work for Goldfinger and ends up killing Dr. No and Oddjob. And the mismatch of characters from unrelated films and roles that makes no sense with the James Bond series. But it's kind of enjoyable, and I didn't mind the gameplay even though it is a bit repetitive, and shooting the enemies kind of looks like the N64 007 game, but still not a bad game in its own right. One, 007 From Russia With Love, released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and PSP. 007 From Russia With Love was the last Bond game published by Electronic Arts, and although it is not as good as Everything or Nothing, it was a high note to end on. From Russia with Love featured the likeness and voice acting of Sean Connery and recreated many of the sets and locations from the 1963 film. The most interesting aspect of the game is seeing these familiar sets and exploring off-camera areas that you were never shown in the film.
May I help you?
A dry martini. Shaken, not stirred.
Certainly, Commander Bond.
Where is the girl?
Elizabeth Stark, the Prime Minister's youngest daughter. We received word half an hour ago there might be another kidnapping attempt.
Closer to home.
She doesn't appear concerned.
Why should she be, with 007 here to protect her?
Too bad. The game is over, Mr. Bond.
I think it's just begun.
Number 22, Quantum of Solace, released October of 2008 for PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, Wii, Xbox 360, Nintendo DS, and Windows. Quantum of Solace was the first James Bond game from Activision, ending EA's 8-game run. It was powered by the Call of Duty 4 engine and was the first Bond game of the generation. The story is based on the films Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, and follows their plots quite closely with some additions. While the shooting is first class, it's the first Bond game in years to have no driving levels, which kinda hurts the variety of gameplay. The music and voice acting are excellent, with the cast including Daniel Craig and Judith Dench. Number 23, Bloodstone, released in 2010 for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Nintendo DS, and Windows. Bloodstone is the second Bond game from Activision that greatly expands upon the gameplay variety of their previous effort. It adds melee attacks, allowing for a more stealthy gameplay, as well as excellent car and boat driving missions that became a highlight of the game.
I'm in position.
Good luck, 007.
Or Goldeneye 007, released in November 2010 on the Wii, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Nintendo DS. Goldeneye 007, a remake of Nintendo 64 title, was released on the Wii the same day as Bloodstone. It featured motion-controlled shooting with the Wii remote and movement of the nunchuck. Don't let the term remake confuse you. The game is a new game from the ground up. It is heavily based on the original. Like the original, the single-player experience is excellent, but multiplayer death matches are more lasting value comes from. Although supporting online multiplayer, 007 shines best in local split-screen shooting bliss, is one of the best multiplayer game titles on the Wii. A remastered version, GoldenEye 007, was released on PS3 and 360 later that year, although it was not well received.
Tower clear.
See if you can find any extra firepower in there.
Five in the last Bond game released. 007 Legends 2012, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Windows, and the Wii U. 007 Legend is the most low-rated Bond game of all time, with aggregate ratings rated from 16 to 45% depending on the platform, and the studio behind the game went bankrupt after its release. The premise is that Daniel Craig's Bond has a flashback to missions from 5 Bond films, including Goldfinger and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, that are retold in a modern-day setting. The gunplay is repetitive, the boss battles are just quick time events, and the stealth mechanics are outdated and not fun.
Phoenix wanted to make sure you had a comfortable flight. It's another hour to Washington, but I've got to keep an eye on the autopilot.
Goldfinger, do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond. I expect you to die.
Bond here.
Morning, 007. I need an update. Did you learn anything from Goldfinger's assistant?
The girl is dead.
What?
He must have gotten wind of our investigation.